Well, we are moving to our next speaker of the night, the final speaker of day 2, actually. And it's a really nice continuation because the last speaker, who is Kat Koppett, founder of Koppett and co-director of Mopco Improv Theatre, is going to share on a very related and important topic. I hope the connection will be with us, and because we're about to discuss ethical storytelling, power, choice, and responsibility. I believe that storytelling is a very powerful tool, and as any tool, as I usually say, you can use the knife to cut the meat for the tribe, or you can cut your tribe to get the meat, but the knife stays the same, and it's really a matter of responsibility. So I'm really glad we are bringing this up at this conference. Kat, welcome.
Hello.
All righty, we can hear and see you. Oh, nope, not yet. Okay, let's wait a couple of minutes, and we will be with Kat in a moment. Our last talk of the night. I hope you're still with us and enjoying the show. We do have some unstable connections at the conference, and I believe us persevering through this has a meaning of its own. And as we discussed with my colleagues before the conference, the fact that we are coming together is a story in itself. Kat, welcome back once again.
Hello, we'll see if we can make this work.
Just to clarify, are you using Google Chrome for this?
I am.
Yes, okay.
Google Chrome.
Okay. Let me know if you need anything, and I'll just be tuning in if the connection fails us. Let me know when to launch the slides, and let's have some fires for Kat, our last speaker of the night.
Woot woot. Well, welcome everyone, or I guess welcome to me to join. For those of you who are just here with Annette, it is in fact a wonderful connection. So much of what she was speaking about at its core was around ethics and morality. I'm actually having 2 of these conversations today, one here with you in the world, and then another here just in my own backyard in person. And I've been thinking a lot about the topic of ethical storytelling after years of working in organizations with leaders and practitioners such as yourselves. At some point, probably later in the process than I should have, I realized, just because this is a powerful tool doesn't mean that people will use it well. And it's so easy in some ways to appropriate the power of story, especially in organizations or especially outside of a pure storytelling environment, for ways that may not be ethical. So I dove down that rabbit hole. For you all, I'm assuming that I don't have to spend a lot of time talking about the power of story. I'm assuming that that is a story that you already know and believe in. But I do think it's interesting to unpack for a moment how that power, how we use that power and what we may or may not be paying attention to. So let me start by sharing a story I heard recently on a podcast called Search Engine, hosted by PJ Vogt, and he was sharing the story of self-driving cars. And it was a 2-episode podcast that he was doing on the topic. And the first episode was all about the creators of self-driving cars. I don't know how it is in your world, but in a lot of places, there's a fear around this technology and a resistance to it, sort of emotional sense that maybe it's a little freaky to get into a car and there isn't a driver. And he started out the episode by talking about a couple of things. One was the motivations of the inventors or the designers who were working on this project. And a lot of them had lost loved ones in motor accidents. And it was a very profound story about the motivation for creating self-driving cars because they were in fact safer. And he made an analogy to, or the designers made an analogy back to when we moved from horse and buggies to horseless carriages, and how in fact we had stripped out sentience from the vehicle. So we think of a car with a human in it as safer, but in fact the horse had sentience. So if the driver fell asleep or got sick or distracted, the horse wasn't just going to walk off a cliff. It would stop if there was something in the road. It would continue on its way, navigating obstacles, even if the driver wasn't paying attention. So what happened for me when I heard this story was, first of all, my story about self-driving cars was reframed, and I understood different values and motives around it. So maybe I'll ask you in the chat, does that strike you as ethical storytelling? How do we feel about that? Does it impact your view of self-driving cars, and do we consider it ethical storytelling? You can just type in chat. It's an interesting question, says Artem. Well, maybe we're smart to not quite put our stake in the ground yet, and just to hold that question. So I offer you that question to hold. I will say a little bit about the power of story as an ethical dilemma before we spend most of our time together thinking about how we might combat the dilemma, by saying that Plato, who I know Annette just mentioned, was adamant that we should be very careful about having story around, and what he called poetry or imagination to create the ideal republic. Because he said, and I quote, "The imitative poet, aka the storyteller, implants an evil constitution, for he indulges the irrational nature which has no discernment of greater and less. He is a manufacturer of images and is very far removed from the truth." So in other words, we have to be careful, because just because it's a good story doesn't mean it's truthful. And in fact, the power of story is so strong that we can misuse it very easily. This is not news. We know this. Propaganda of any kind is just storytelling that we mistrust. We label it propaganda. Disinformation, which is more and more ubiquitously available and easy to create, is just storytelling that is untethered from facts and data or positive ethical intention. And this is more and more ubiquitous in our world. As chief storytelling officers, as storytelling practitioners, the question of what makes an ethical story, how do we use the power for good, is one question. Before we answer that question, when we're working with our clients or our organizations, I think we have to ask, why do we care? Like, why do we even care if story is ethical? If I can have more influence and manipulate you to do what I want you to do, why do I even care? What is ethics, right? Is there such a thing? Why do I care about it? Fortunately for us, there seems to be a fair amount of data that says that ethical behavior in organizations, that ethical organizations are in fact more successful at achieving their goal, even if that goal is just to be more profitable. So if we have to pitch or sell ethics to people who may only care about a bottom line, we can quote things like 50% more performance with stronger ethical cultures, defined as places where what's said and what's done align. Ethical cultures seem to be almost 3 times more adaptable to what's happening. They're resilient. They're able to survive strong things and stay focused. They're 8 times more likely to uphold standards under pressure. And then there's similar statistics. I'll give you, you all have slides that I will give you so you can check these references, but similar statistics about the downside or price of not being ethical. So if we buy that story is powerful, and we buy that behaving ethically is something that we are aligned with as organizations, whether those are sort of instrumental values or terminal values for us, then the question becomes, how do we tell? How can we be ethical in our storytelling? I see that there's a question already in chat. Is it possible to perceive story as manipulation? It's possible to perceive story as manipulation. And I think that's exactly right. I think that on some level, it is good for us to recognize that when we're telling a story, we have an intention to move or influence others. Certainly in organizations, we're not just telling story for philosophy. We're telling story because we're wanting to clarify a vision, inspire people to move in a certain way, achieve goals, connect and unite, right? There are things that we're trying to do with our storytelling. And yeah, saying we want to have influence or inspire people sounds different than saying we want to manipulate you. But what really is the difference, right? What is the ethical difference? I think this is an appropriate question. So let's dive into it and say, what might we do? I always feel like, even in a storytelling conference, that I need to define my terms a little bit. The first time I ever presented on story at a conference, the guy in the back row, academic, raised his hand and said, "I'm sorry, can you define your terms?" And I said, it's story. We all know what a story is, but we don't all know. And I think that it's transparent for me. I should be transparent and say that when I talk about story, I'm sort of on one end of a spectrum here, probably in our community, where I have colleagues who will be very specific about, this is a story, this is not a story. This kind of communication counts as story, this doesn't. And I'm way over here on this end of the spectrum. We believe that storytelling is a fundamental meaning-making thing that our brains do all the time, at any time. Anytime we're communicating on some level, we're offering a story. Our listeners are making up stories in their heads. So then the question becomes, what stories are we telling? How are we telling them? How are we choosing them? Who gets to tell them? As opposed to, are we telling story or not? Yes, so Artem, I've been sort of avoiding the slides, putting them up just to chat to you all, but I guess it makes sense to put up some slides. So go ahead and put them up. There are, I'm on slide 7 now, for those of you who like progress. We've moved ahead. I guess I can get there for you too, can't I? It's, my connection is a little bit slow too, so it's spinning, but I'll get there as soon as I can. In the meantime, while we wait for those, there's sort of 3 levels of story that we can look at. We can look at anecdote or small contained, self-contained stories, which I think we often talk about in this environment. What are the examples we're using? What are the narratives that we're sharing as self-contained narratives when we're looking this session that I'm telling you right now? What's the beginning, middle, and end of that? The story of this conference. Before the conference, we felt and thought a certain way. After the conference, we felt and thought a certain way. That's the main message or the core narrative. And then there's also just the stories that we're swimming in, the sort of assumptions and beliefs and narratives that we carry with us. Maybe in a different environment, I might have folks saying, storytelling is just for kids, right? Or it's storytelling is by definition fluffy and an extra, as opposed to storytelling as a core meaning-making skill that we are using all the time, right? Those are ambient narratives. So at every level, we can ask, how ethical are those stories? What are the general ambient narratives that people have about our organization, and are they true? What is the meaning of a meeting that I'm having right now? What's the story I'm trying to tell? And then what are the examples that I'm using? So given all of that context, let's look at how can we be consciously more ethical storytellers. And it comes down to asking a few questions. Let me tell you the story of electric vehicles again. I came away from that first episode about electric vehicles, and I thought, wow, I was wrong. I am influenced. Electric vehicles are clearly safer. The people who are creating them have the best intentions. We should definitely commit to this. Sounds great to me. The next episode interviewed Uber drivers, drivers for hire, right, in Boston, who were adamant that self-driving cars should be kept out of Boston. And they have a strong union culture. A lot of them had been taxi drivers who you had to buy a license. There were only a few people who could drive. And Uber came in and wiped out that whole business. But a lot of the drivers got on board with Uber because they saw the future. They were willing to adapt. But now here came self-driving cars, and they were going to be put out of business. So I listened to this story and I thought, oh, well, I guess there's a price similar to the conversation we're having with AI. Maybe it's not so good. Maybe we should be careful. Maybe it's safer, but do we want to eliminate human fallibility in the world? Isn't that just eliminating humans? What do we do about that? And then I heard a third story. The third story was the story of the community that reacted to the Uber drivers who had made a lot of progress passing this law to ban self-driving cars, who were visually impaired or somehow physically disabled and couldn't drive themselves. And to them, it was imperative that we had self-driving cars because they could have autonomy. They could get around. They wouldn't be, when there were cars that were being driven by people, sometimes the driver would say, no, I won't let your dog in the car, or it's too much effort for me. I'm not going to pick you up. So all of a sudden we have, as Annette was saying, a more complex picture because we have more voices in the story. The first thing that we want to know is what is the intention of our story, and then how can we get the right voices in. In this picture here, this is my theater company. We posted this picture. It was from a scene that we did, and we got a lot of feedback that this, it looked like this actor was hanged, that they were somehow being hanged. We never saw that because it wasn't what was going on in the scene. It wasn't what we meant. But the impact of what we're trying to do and what is being received is the first thing that we need to do. So first we need to know our intention and choose a story that's aligned with it. Now, in the self-driving cars intention, that's in place for all of those people, right? They're saying, my intention is to understand, have you be behind this? Cars are safer. Self-driverless cars are safer. You should do it. Or you're going to put us out of work. Here's my story about that. We need this autonomy and support. They can do that. But it's only when we have all of the voices in the conversation that we can really get a full picture. So when it comes to the who, so first we have our intent, then we have to ask whose story is it? Who is the person speaking, right? How much power do they have in the organization? If a person with a lot of formal authority and position in the organization tells a story, that is received in a different way than if someone at a lower rank or with less authority or influence tells the story. It's good to know where you're coming from. Whose story is it, right? The story of the self-driving cars is very different from all of those different vantage points. Do I have permission to tell someone else's story, right? Are they telling it in their voice? Am I inviting them in, or am I telling their story? I tell a story about a Paralympic athlete that we worked in, telling his story of his injury. I have to make sure that I have his permission and that I'm telling it the way he wants it to be told to serve the moral that he tells it. If I appropriate his story and say, I'm going to use the disabled community to talk about how great self-driving cars are, but they don't really want it, that is unethical. Who am I telling the story to? If I'm telling a story to my employees because I want to manipulate them into working harder or doing more, that's not great. And Artem, I just want to let you know that for some reason the text is coming into me in Russian now. I don't know what happened, so I can't read it. You're going to have to translate for me, unless you can tell me how to get back to English.
You mean, Maria is asking whose fight opens in that story, and then leaf emoji. Whose brawl or who's
fighting?
Yeah.
In which in the self-driving car story?
I'm not sure which story Maria is relating. Yeah. I guess it's just a reflection.
I don't know why I'm not in English anymore, but because I'm in English. But okay. I mean, in the self-driving car, there are a couple of fights, right? In the city of Boston, in general, right, there are all sorts of influences and all sorts of constituents. So you can see, in this specific case in Boston, the city council is trying to pass a law to ban self-driving cars because people are afraid of them. They think they're unsafe, and because the drivers, Uber drivers and others, have a very strong voice. That's many people say Boston is a union town, right? So they're unionized. They have a very strong coalition. And obviously it's not good for their work if self-driving cars come in. So that's one contingent. Obviously the companies creating self-driving cars are fighting for us to change our view of them and open them, sort of like AI is fighting for us to embrace it. And then there's these other constituents like the community of visually impaired or disabled folks who are saying, we need this. So you can see how the who really matters. And maybe one of the most overlooked questions in terms of the who is absent? Like, whose voice are we not hearing? I just told you 3 voices, but who else might need to be in the room, right? Maybe mothers of teenagers who died in car accidents, maybe larger economics, the city developers. What does it do to general economics if we have more and more of these, not just cars, but more and more jobs going away? What does that do to a city? I'm sure there are other constituents that we would want to ask. But to be ethical, we need to invite all of those voices in. So the first question we want to ask is, what's our intent? And is the story we're telling aligning with that? The second is whose voices are in the room? Whose voices are not? Who gets to tell their story? Who doesn't get to tell their story, right? Often it's people in the most senior leadership who have the platform to tell the story, and we don't really hear from the disenfranchised because by definition, they're disenfranchised. Let's skip this for now. The second question is what? What stories are told? Annette talks about this a lot. I think we have other practitioners here who talk about this a lot. Like, are stories too simple? Are they reductive? Are they stories of exceptions, right? We tell a story of the exceptional person who was born in poverty and had no resources and pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and became a billionaire. And this is supposed to be a story about how the system shouldn't matter, and it's all about individual effort and tenacity and grit. Well, okay, but is that actually an exceptional story, which is not reflecting what's true for most people in most situations? How many different stories are we telling? If we just tell one story over and over again, does that obscure or limit our view of what's actually happening and the complexity, as Annette was saying, of really understanding what's needed? And what types of stories are told? For example, in an organization, we might just tell these beautiful, inspiring vision stories of what our technology is going to do in the world and all the good it can do, and we sort of ignore or silence or don't ever tell the stories of the challenges or the dangers. That's unethical, right? Because it's silencing truth as opposed to offering it. And then the last question so we've asked why, we've asked how, we've asked what. The final question is how. As an individual story practitioner and as a leader harvesting, sourcing, and supporting and elevating stories in the organization, how are those stories being told? So the first is simple honesty. To what extent are we thinking of caring and testing whether our story is true or not? When I tell this, when I investigate this concept in a larger workshop and I have people work on their own stories and I have to pitch storytelling and the impact of storytelling, I tell the story of Elizabeth Holmes of Theranos, the company. Many of you probably know this story, right? She was worth $8 billion because she told this beautiful story and convinced all sorts of important, powerful people in her young 20s, right out of Stanford, that she had a product where you could take a drop of blood and complete all of these labs, that it was going to revolutionize healthcare. And she told that story very, very effectively, very passionately, with lots of charisma, all of the things that we teach leaders and great storytellers to do. But it just wasn't true. It wasn't based in fact. And people didn't test her story. They didn't, they just took her word for it because she was a good storyteller. And she silenced people who tried to talk about against her, but it was very, very successful. When I was investigating, when I was looking to put this story up and talk about her, I found images of her when I searched for images of her that made her look very dark and like a villain. And I was like, ooh, look at the storytelling here. And then I vetted the picture and it wasn't even a picture of her. It was just a picture of an actor who looked like her. So even in looking for how do I talk about ethical storytelling, I had to be very careful to vet my sources and not make assumptions. The second how we have to ask is, are we telling our stories inclusively? Does it represent complexity fairly? Does it honor the people whose stories we're telling? Does it allow them to have voice themselves as opposed to using them as a symbol or a metaphor that they're not actually aligned with, right? If you're telling my story, you better let me in on how you're telling it. We do need to tell stories effectively. If we can't tell them with clarity and in a way that has impact and where people understand where we're actually coming from, in some ways that's unethical too, because if we have a good story and it's honest and we can't tell it, then we're not having the positive impact we could have. This feels most important to me when I'm working with scientists. We work with a lot of scientists who have brilliant research and incredible data, but if they can't tell their story in a way that we lay people can understand and receive it, then we can't understand it and we won't support it, and their work goes unheeded. So on some level, that's an ethical dilemma too. And finally, we need to be responsible, circling back to our why, to vet what is happening to our story after we tell it. Are other people repeating it in a way that loses its clarity and its legitimacy? Are they appropriating it, right, for and misrepresenting it? Are people doing things with the story that we don't want? You know, if I might have the most moral, ethical, truthful story, but if someone else is using it and saying, oh, this is permission to act violently or to shut something down or to act unethically in a way, then am I tracking the impact of that story? So those are all the questions that we can ask about different kinds of story. I invite you to take a story that you tell or a story that lives in your organization and run it through these lenses. Is it serving the purpose? Does it match my intention? Whose voice is dominating? What voices are missing? What story should I be telling? What story is the right story to tell in this context with the right frequency? Values are reflected, and then how are we telling it in the right ways? I think that the Search Engine Podcast did a lovely job of asking those questions and telling very nuanced stories that left me both knowing more about what was true, what questions I should be asking, and why it was a complex conversation. I came away more confused and more informed and more inspired to learn more, which I think is the measure of ethical storytelling. Here's the framework that you can take. Again, you have that in your slides, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much.
This,
Yeah, we actually have a question, so let me just read it out so the translator can catch it up. Can you share, in the US American context, would you describe the conversation about story and storytelling as big city-centric? Maybe you could briefly share examples of the contrary.
Yeah. I think what's true is that in any context, right, some voices have more power than other voices. And I think one of the reasons that we're, from my vantage point, in a little bit of trouble in the US right now is because certain voices dominated that didn't realize they were dominating, and certain voices didn't feel heard. So big city, you know, if you have the manufacturing of story on an industrial scale happening in big cities, then that is going to overwhelm other voices. Hollywood, New York City, right? It wasn't just that there were more people congregated there, but it was that these were folks who are manufacturing the stories, right? Our television and our film and our news organizations were very much based in big cities. So I do think that there was, in later times, you know, originally, if you look at Mark Twain and sort of the foundations of our country, there was a lot of folk tales, right? A lot of Wild West stories, a lot of individual, you know, if you think about Abraham Lincoln, right, sort of a log cabin, a lot of country-based stories. And then as things moved into the industrial age, they became more city-based. I think there are other voices that we over-rotated on as well. It's a dilemma a little bit. You know, right now I think there's some conversation in academia about which voices have been amplified more than others. And there's some questions, right? It's a complicated story. Is that because certain voices are more true or more aligned with the values of an academic setting? Or is it because there's a constraint around real openness to lots of different values and points of view? So it's an interesting conversation. Hope that answers your question.
It surely does for me. Michelle, if you would like to comment, if it does for you, that would be great. Marine is, yeah, and you have a thank you so much. So yes, it does.
I see that.
Marine is actually reflecting on one more case from Russia, a Dodo pizza case where ethics helped them survive really nasty situations. And that's actually based upon Marina's reflection. I have a quick question here. It's really difficult to uphold ethics because it takes a burden on your storytelling. It limits the stories you can tell and the ways you can tell them. What are the ways to encourage people to take the step into like embracing the ethics? And I mean, not in terms of like upbringing and being a good parent. I mean, in organizations where it's sometimes very shady.
I mean, I think this is the fundamental question, right? I mean, it's where I started. I've been working on this program. It matters to me. I'm working with a number of places in the US right now, an organization called Policy Link, which is supporting senior leaders in exactly this way, right? Forget storytelling. How can we behave ethically when there's a lot of pressure not to, right? If it were easy, we wouldn't need to call it ethics, right? If you ultimately just got rewarded for doing the right thing, everybody would do the right thing, right? The problem is when there are in fact rewards for skirting your morals or stepping out of what feels right because it's scary or you're going to get punished, or there's a giant reward for being slippery and not doing it the right way. So I think it's a real question, right? Like, why should an organizations or senior leaders want to work ethically? One answer is there does seem to be data that at least in the long term, if you are behaving ethically, you are more likely to succeed and survive and thrive and innovate and adapt and succeed, right? Because if we don't have a grounded foundation into this is what we believe, this is what we think is right, we are trustworthy, you can trust us, then it all crumbles, right? In the short term, maybe you can grab something, but I know that one of the reasons that the US has succeeded as a center of excellence and innovation and industry is because there was a rule of law, and because there was, if you did something wrong, you got punished, right? We have these agreements about this is the right way to do things, and if you stepped out of it, there was some punishment for that. So people wanted to do business here because they felt like, oh, I can trust a contract that I have. I can trust an agreement. If I buy something, I'll get it. And if it's broken, there'll be compensation. As soon as you do away with that, as soon as you don't have a sort of ethical foundational agreement, how can you get people to invest? How do you trust? How do you get your employees to be devoted and committed to you and trust what you're saying when you are trying to motivate them if you're not trustworthy? I mean, it's sort of tautological, but yeah. And then, of course, the other question is just, I don't know, if we believe in right and wrong, then we want to be aligned with right and wrong. But that doesn't seem to be an argument that's getting a lot of traction these days, unfortunately.
Yeah, that is so true. I like that you emphasize that in the long run, ethics helps out if you stay on that course. That's a great argument for those who are playing the long game. Yeah, lovely.
Yeah.
We have one more question from Ritu Parna,
Mm,
if you would comment that shortly. So let me just voice it out.
I think I see it in
When it
English.
comes,
Yeah.
it's just for the translator. So
Yeah.
when it comes to using stories to bring forth ethical dilemmas, the risk is that personal biases, prejudices, beliefs, and experience may slow the outcome of stories. How do you use ethical dilemmas in the interventions you design for business?
Yeah. I really love what Annette said about we don't want too much clarity, right? The whole part of the value of story, if we're using it ethically, is that it is nuanced and complex, and we can confront assumptions that we have, right? So at those three levels of story that I started with at the beginning, bias, prejudices, beliefs, assumptions are sort of the ambient narratives that we're swimming in. And so one of the things that we do in our workshops with organizations is identify those stories that sometimes can be like, the water that the fish swim in, where we don't even notice them. They just seem, either we don't notice them at all, or they just assume sort of factually true without questioning them. So part of ethical storytelling is to notice and note and investigate and test the stories that are already existing that we're just taking for granted. And then if we say, oh, this is a bias that people have that is incorrect or that's influencing us in bad ways, then you say, okay, this story's here. How can we come up with, how can we include more stories that combat that, stories that might move the needle, stories that open up that story or challenge it, right? So it's not ever one story. It's what is the ecosystem of stories and how do we expand it and confront it?
Love it. Thank you so much. We have a couple of more questions in the chat, but I guess being conscious of the time, I
Yeah.
believe we can. I will leave the contact so people can reach out and continue the discussion, because talking about ethics is an unending journey. But I want to leave you with the traditional question, and let me say it once again. So story can be applied in different ways and for different tasks. What would be one task that you would apply story for if all the others were impossible?
It's such an impossible question, as you know, Artem, because especially since I really believe that storytelling is this sort of core meaning-making activity that always exists. It is the important thing anytime we're trying to make meaning of anything. But I think in this context, what I would say is that, right? That storytelling is important for making meaning, right? Recognizing it as a conscious meaning-making tool to be able to communicate, test, investigate, and connect across understanding is really at its core what we're doing with story. And then we can figure out what action to take once we're deeply understanding each other. Did I skirt the question?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. Meaning making for understanding and connection. That's lovely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. You've been a star of this evening, and here are the fires that burn for you. Thank you for bringing the ethics to this conference.
Thank you. It's a wonderful conversation, and I would love to continue it and learn more and hear from everybody. So reach out. I'd love to hear your stories.
Thank you.
See ya.
Oh, this has been the second day of our conference. I hope you're enjoying this journey, and we'll be wrapping things up for tonight. I'm looking forward to seeing you tomorrow at 9 a.m. We will continue with the talks and discussions. Our next day will be consisting of two parts: morning part for Moscow time, and then evening part, the same as today. So if you'll be joining us later in the evening, we'll meet at 5 p.m. Moscow time. I hope you have a nice evening after this conference and new thoughts after these speeches of today. Thank you so much. See you tomorrow.